Rocky clearance, good evening, Lion Inter 8517 ready for pushback at Bravo 3. Cleared for pushback Lion Inter 8517. Rocky ground, Lion Inter 8517 ready to taxi. Taxi to 09 Lion Inter 8517. Rocky Tower, Lion Inter 8517 ready for takeoff on 09er. Cleared for takeoff on 09er Lion Inter 8517.
Rocky clearance, good evening, US Air 4333 ready for pushback at Alpha 2.
Cleared to land on 09 AirBerlin 7458.
Cleared for pushback US Air 4333. Rocky ground, US Air 4333 ready to taxi. Taxi to 09er US Air 4333.
Rocky ground, Berlin 7458 taxi to the gates.
Rocky Tower, good evening. Air Canada 2964 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Air Canada 2964.
Cleared for pushback Air Canada 6459er. Taxi to gate Bravo 3 Berlin 7458.
Rocky Tower, US Air 4333 ready for takeoff on 09er.
Taxi to 09er Air Canada 6459er.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er US Air 4333.
Rocky ground, Air Canada 2964 taxi to the gates.
Rocky Tower, Air Canada 6459er ready for takeoff on 09er.
Rocky Tower, good evening, Air Canada 9620 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Air Canada 9620.
Cleared for pushback Etihad 7965.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er Air Canada 6459er.
Taxi to gate Bravo 2 Air Canada 2964.
Taxi to 09er Etihad 7965.
Rocky ground, Air Canada 9620 taxi to the gates. Taxi to gate Bravo 6 Air Canada 9620.
Rocky Tower, Etihad 7965 ready for takeoff on 09er. Cleared for takeoff on 09er Etihad 7965. Cleared to land on 09er Philippines 1816.
Cleared for pushback Berlin 2621. Rocky ground, Berlin 2621 ready to taxi. Taxi to 09er Berlin 2621.
Rocky ground, Philippines 1816 taxi to the gates.
Rocky Tower, Berlin 2621 ready for takeoff on 09er. Cleared for takeoff on 09er Berlin 2621.
Rocky Tower, good evening, Philippines 5032 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Philippines 5032.
Rocky ground, Egyptair 9817 ready to taxi. Taxi to gate Bravo 4 Philippines 1816. Taxi to 09er Egyptair 9817.
Rocky ground, Philippines 5032 taxi to the gates.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er Egyptair 9817.
Rocky clearance, good evening, US Air 1033 ready for pushback at Bravo 7.
Cleared to land on 09er Egyptair 3758.
Cleared for pushback US Air 1033. Taxi to gate Bravo 5 Philippines 5032. Taxi to 09er US Air 1033. Rocky Tower, US Air 1033 ready for takeoff on 09er.
Rocky Ground, Egypt Air 3758 taxi to the gates.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er US Air 1033. Rocky clearance, good evening. Lion Inter 5759er ready for pushback at Alpha 1.
Cleared to land on 09er Philippines 8264.
Rocky ground, Lion Inter 5759er ready to taxi.
Taxi to gate Bravo 7 Egypt Air 3758.
Taxi to 09er Lion Inter 5759er.
Rocky Ground, Philippines 8264 taxi to the gates. Taxi to gate Alpha 1 Philippines 8264.
Rocky clearance, good evening. Egypt Air 3265 ready for pushback at Alpha 3.
Rocky Tower, good evening. Philippines 4120 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Philippines 4120.
Cleared for pushback Egypt Air 3265. Rocky Tower, Lion Inter 5759er ready for takeoff on 09er. Taxi to 09er Egypt Air 3265. Cleared for takeoff on 09er Lion Inter 5759er.
Rocky Ground, Philippines 4120 taxi to the gates.
Cleared for pushback Lion Inter 8121.
Cleared for pushback Berlin 7459er.
Rocky Tower, good evening. Air Canada 6516 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Air Canada 6516.
Taxi to gate Bravo 3 Philippines 4120.
Taxi to 09er Lion Inter 8121.
Taxi to 09er Berlin 7459er. Cleared for takeoff on 09er Egypt Air 3265.
Rocky Ground, Air Canada 6516 taxi to the gates.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er Berlin 7459er.
Rocky clearance, good evening. Air Canada 2965 ready for pushback at Bravo 2. Cleared to land on 09er Air Canada 7332.
Cleared for pushback Lion Inter 4517.
Taxi to gate Bravo 1 Air Canada 6516.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er Lion Inter 8121.
Cleared for pushback Air Canada 2965.
Cleared for pushback Air Canada 9621. Taxi to 09er Lion Inter 4517.
Taxi to 09er Air Canada 2965.
Taxi to 09er Air Canada 9621.
Rocky ground, Air Canada 7332 taxi to the gates.
Rocky Tower, good evening. Etihad 2458 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Etihad 2458.
Cleared for pushback Lion Inter 6333.
Taxi to gate Bravo 6 Air Canada 7332.
Rocky Tower, Air Canada 9621 ready for takeoff on 09er. Taxi to 09er Lion Inter 6333. Cleared for takeoff on 09er Air Canada 9621.
Rocky Ground, Etihad 2458 taxi to the gates.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er Air Canada 2965.
Rocky Tower, good evening. Egypt Air 9964 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Egypt Air 9964. Cleared for takeoff on 09er Lion Inter 4517.
Rocky Ground, Etihad 2458 requesting taxi to the gates.
Rocky Tower, Egypt Air 9964 is going around. Rocky Tower, Lion Inter 6333 ready for takeoff on 09er.
Rocky clearance, good evening, Philippines 1817 ready for pushback at Bravo 4.
Cleared for takeoff on 09 Lion into 6333.
Taxi to gate Bravo 2 Etihad 2458.
Rocky clearance, good evening, Philippines 5033 ready for pushback at Bravo 5. Cleared for pushback, Philippines 5033.
Rocky Tower, good evening, Air Canada 1620 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Air Canada 1620.
Taxi to 09er Philippines 5033.
Cleared for pushback, Philippines 1817. Taxi to 09er Philippines 1817.
Rocky Tower, Philippines 5033 ready for takeoff on 09er. Cleared for takeoff on 09er Philippines 5033.
Rocky Ground, Air Canada 1620 taxi to the gates.
Rocky Tower, Philippines 1817 ready for takeoff on 09er.
Cleared to land on 09er Berlin 5816.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er Philippines 1817.
Rocky Ground, Air Canada 1620 requesting taxi to the gates.
Cleared for pushback, Egyptair 3759er. Rocky ground, Egyptair 3759er ready to taxi. Taxi to 09er Egyptair 3759er. Rocky ground, Berlin 5816 taxi to the gates.
Rocky Tower, good evening, Berlin 3032 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Berlin 3032.
Rocky Tower, Egyptair 3759er ready for takeoff on 09er. Taxi to gate Bravo 4 Berlin 5816.
Cleared for pushback, Philippines 8265. Taxi to 09er Philippines 8265.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er Egyptair 3759er.
Rocky Ground, Berlin 3032 taxi to the gates.
Rocky Tower, good evening, Egyptair 9er is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Egyptair 9er.
Taxi to gate Bravo 7 Berlin 3032.
Rocky clearance, good evening, Philippines 4121 ready for pushback at Bravo 3. Cleared to land on 09er Turkish 8758. Cleared for pushback, Philippines 4121.
Rocky Tower, Philippines 8265 ready for takeoff on 09er.
Taxi to gate Bravo 3 Egyptair 9er.
Taxi to 09er Philippines 4121.
Rocky Tower, good evening, Lion into 4264 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Lion into 4264.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er Philippines 8265.
Taxi to gate Alpha 1 Turkish 8758. Rocky Tower, Philippines 4121 ready for takeoff on 09er.
Cleared for pushback, Air Canada 6517.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er Philippines 4121.
Rocky Tower, good evening, Egyptair 6120 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Egyptair 6120.
Taxi to gate Bravo 1 Lion into 4264.
Taxi to 09er Air Canada 6517. Rocky Tower, Air Canada 6517 ready for takeoff on 09er. Cleared for takeoff on 09er Air Canada 6517.
Rocky ground, Egyptair 6120 taxi to the gates.
Cleared to land on 09er US Air 7516.
Taxi to gate Alpha 2 Egyptair 6120.
Cleared for pushback Air Canada 7333. Rocky ground, Air Canada 7333 ready to taxi. Taxi to 09er Air Canada 7333.
Rocky ground, US Air 7516 taxi to the gates.
Rocky Tower, good evening. Air Canada 2332 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Air Canada 2332.
Taxi to gate Bravo 6 US Air 7516.
Rocky Tower, Air Canada 7333 ready for takeoff on 09er.
Cleared for pushback Etihad 2459er.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er Air Canada 7333.
Taxi to 09er Etihad 2459er.
Rocky ground, Air Canada 2332 taxi to the gates.
Cleared to land on 09er Lion Inter 9458.
Rocky ground, Air Canada 2332 requesting taxi to the gates. Taxi to gate Bravo 2 Air Canada 2332.
Rocky Tower, Etihad 2459er ready for takeoff on 09er. Cleared for takeoff on 09er Etihad 2459er.
Rocky ground, Lion Inter 9458 taxi to the gates.
Rocky clearance, good evening. Air Canada 1621 ready for pushback at Bravo 5.
Cleared to land on 09er Etihad 1964.
Rocky ground, Lion Inter 9458 requesting taxi to the gates.
Taxi to 09er Air Canada 1621.
Taxi to gate Bravo 5 Lion Inter 9458.
Rocky clearance, good evening. Berlin 5817 ready for pushback at Bravo 4. Cleared for pushback Berlin 5817.
Rocky ground, Etihad 1964 taxi to the gates.
Cleared to land on 09er Turkish 5620. Cleared for takeoff on 09er Air Canada 1621.
Taxi to 09er Berlin 5817.
Taxi to gate Bravo 4 Etihad 1964.
Rocky Tower, Berlin 5817 ready for takeoff on 09er.
Rocky ground, Turkish 5620 taxi to the gates.
Rocky Tower, good evening. Etihad 3816 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Etihad 3816.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er Berlin 5817.
Rocky ground, Turkish 5620 requesting taxi to the gates.
Cleared for pushback Berlin 3033. Rocky ground, Etihad 3816 taxi to the gates. Taxi to 09er Berlin 3033.
Rocky Tower, good evening. US Air 8032 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er US Air 8032.
Taxi to gate Bravo 7 Etihad 3816. Rocky Tower, Berlin 3033 ready for takeoff on 09er.
Rocky clearance, good evening. Turkish 8759 are ready for pushback at Alpha 1.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er Berlin 3033.
Rocky Tower, good evening. Berlin 4758 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Berlin 4758.
Taxi to 09er Egyptair 9er65.
Taxi to 09er Turkish 8759er.
Rocky ground, US Air 8032 requesting taxi to the gates. Taxi to gate Bravo 3 US Air 8032. Rocky Tower, Egyptair 9er65 ready for takeoff on 09er.
Cleared to land on 09er Air Canada 6264.
Taxi to gate Alpha 1 Berlin 4758.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er Egyptair 9er65.
Rocky clearance, good evening. Egyptair 6121 ready for pushback at Alpha 2.
Rocky clearance, good evening. Lion into 4265 ready for pushback at Bravo 1.
Rocky Tower, Turkish 8759 ready for takeoff on 09er. Cleared for takeoff on 09er Turkish 8759er.
Rocky Tower, good evening. Etihad 7120 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Etihad 7120.
Taxi to 09er Egyptair 6121.
Taxi to 09 Lion into 4265.
Rocky ground, Air Canada 6264 requesting taxi to the gates.
Rocky clearance, good evening. US Air 7517 ready for pushback at Bravo 6. Rocky Tower, good evening. Egypt Air 2516 is on final for 09er. Clear to land on 09er Egypt Air 2516.
Taxi to gate Bravo 1 Air Canada 6264.
Taxi to gate Alpha 5 Etihad 7120.
Rocky Tower, Lion into 4265 ready for takeoff on 09er.
Taxi to 09er US Air 7517.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er Lion into 4265.
Rocky Tower, good evening. US Air 9er 332 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er US Air 9er 332.
Taxi to gate Bravo 6 Egypt Air 2516.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er Egypt Air 6121.
Rocky Tower, US Air 7517 ready for takeoff on 09er.
Cleared for pushback Air Canada 2333.
Cleared for pushback Lion into 9459er.
Cleared to land on 09er Etihad 1458.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er US Air 7517.
Taxi to gate Bravo 5 US Air 9er 332.
Taxi to 09er Air Canada 2333.
Taxi to 09er Lion into 9459er.
Rocky ground, Etihad 1458 taxi to the gates.
Cleared to land on 09er Berlin 5964.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er Lion into 9459er.
Rocky clearance, good night. Etihad 1965 ready for pushback at Bravo 4.
Taxi to gate Bravo 2 Etihad 1458. Rocky Tower, Air Canada 2333 ready for takeoff on 09er.
Rocky clearance, good night. Turkish 5621 ready for pushback at Alpha 3.
Rocky Tower, good night. Berlin 3620 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Berlin 3620.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er Air Canada 2333.
Taxi to 09er Turkish 5621.
Taxi to 09er Etihad 1965.
Taxi to gate Bravo 4 Berlin 5964.
Rocky Tower, good night. Egypt Air 8816 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Egypt Air 8816.
Rocky ground, Berlin 3620 taxi to the gates.
Rocky Tower, Etihad 1965 ready for takeoff on 09er.
Taxi to gate Alpha 3 Berlin 3620.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er Etihad 1965.
Rocky Tower, good night. Turkish 4032 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Turkish 4032. Cleared for takeoff on 09er Turkish 5621.
Taxi to gate Alpha 2 Egypt Air 8816.
Rocky clearance, good night. US Air 8033 ready for pushback at Bravo 3.
Rocky clearance, good night. Etihad 3817 ready for pushback at Bravo 7.
Cleared for pushback US Air 8033.
Cleared to land on 09 Berlin 6758.
Rocky ground, Etihad 3817 ready to taxi.
Taxi to 09 US Air 8033.
Taxi to gate Bravo 3 Turkish 4032.
Taxi to 09 Etihad 3817. Rocky Tower, Etihad 3817 ready for takeoff on 09.
Cleared to land on 09 Berlin 7264.
Cleared for takeoff on 09 Etihad 3817.
Rocky ground, Berlin 6758 taxi to the gates.
Rocky Tower, US Air 8033 ready for takeoff on 09er.
Cleared for pushback Berlin 4759er.
Taxi to gate Bravo 7 Berlin 6758.
Rocky Tower good night, Lion Air 2120 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Lion Air 2120.
Taxi to 09er Berlin 4759er.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er US Air 8033. Rocky ground, Berlin 7264 taxi to the gates. Rocky Tower good night, Air Canada 90516 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Air Canada 90516. Taxi to 09er Etihad 7121. Rocky ground, Berlin 7264 requesting taxi to the gates.
Taxi to 09 Air Canada 6265.
Taxi to gate Alpha 5 Lion Air 2120.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er Berlin 4759er.
Rocky Tower good night, Etihad 1332 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Etihad 1332.
Taxi to gate Bravo 1 Berlin 7264.
Cleared for pushback Egypt Air 2517.
Rocky ground, Air Canada 90516 taxi to the gates.
Rocky Tower, Air Canada 6265 ready for takeoff on 09.
Cleared to land on 09 Egypt Air 5458.
Cleared for pushback US Air 9333.
Taxi to 09 Egypt Air 2517.
Taxi to gate Bravo 6 Air Canada 90516.
Cleared for takeoff on 09 Air Canada 6265.
Rocky ground, Etihad 1332 requesting taxi to the gates.
Rocky Tower good night, Philippines 3964 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09 Philippines 3964.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er Etihad 7121. Rocky Tower, US Air 9333 ready for takeoff on 09er.
Taxi to gate Bravo 5 Etihad 1332.
Cleared for takeoff on 09 Egypt Air 2517.
Taxi to gate Alpha 1 Egypt Air 5458.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er US Air 9333.
Rocky ground, Philippines 3964 taxi to the gates. Rocky Tower good night, Air Canada 8620 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Air Canada 8620. Taxi to gate Alpha 4 Philippines 3964.
Cleared for pushback Etihad 1459er. Rocky ground, Etihad 1459er ready to taxi. Taxi to 09er Etihad 1459er.
Rocky Tower good night, Egypt Air 4816 is on final for 09er. Cleared to land on 09er Egypt Air 4816. Rocky ground, Berlin 3621 ready to taxi.
Rocky ground, Air Canada 8620 taxi to the gates.
Cleared for pushback Berlin 5965.
Taxi to 09er Berlin 3621.
Cleared for takeoff on 09er Etihad 1459er.
Cleared to land on 09er Turkish 6032.
Taxi to gate Bravo 2 Air Canada 8620.
taxi to 09er Berlin 5965.
Rocky ground, Egypt Air 4816 taxi to the gates.
Cleared for push